Notice. Frederick Douglass, recently a slave, will lecture tonight on the Commons. Notice. Frederick Douglass, recently a slave, will lecture on the Commons tonight at 7 o'clock. Those who are interested in the workings of slavery, from one of the slaves himself, are respectfully invited to attend. Notice, Frederick Douglass recently... Notice, Frederick Douglass, recently a slave, will speak tonight. Yes, it's true. For my own lectures, I often had to act as my own town crier. I lectured all over the North on behalf of the American Anti-Slavery Society. I was Exhibit A, a fugitive slave subject to recapture, and living proof that a slave is a person and not a beast of burden. Exhibit A was the abolitionists. Abolition. It was a word that interested me even before I knew what it meant. For I discovered that whatever or whoever abolitionists might be, they were most cordially hated and abused by slaveholders. And, oh, what a joy and gladness it produced to discover that abolitionists were a class of people in the North who were moving for our freedom. So I spoke for them most willingly. The son of a slaveholder stands before you by a colored mother. In Talbot County, Eastern Shore, state of Maryland, near Easton, the county town, there's a small district of country remarkable for nothing that I know of. I say remarkable for nothing that I know of, more than for the worn-out, sandy, desert-like disposition of the soil, the general dilapidation of the farms and fences, and the prevalence of ague and fever. It was in this dull, flat, unthrifty district or neighborhood, bordered by the Choptank River, among the laziest and muddiest of streams, and surrounded by a white population of the lowest order, indolent and drunken to a proverb, and among slaves who, in point of ignorance and indolence, were fully in accord with their surroundings, that I, through no fault of my own, was born and spent the first years of my childhood. Now, you must not expect me to say much about my family. Genealogical trees do not flourish among slaves. Most slaves know little more of their ages than horses do of theirs. I never met with a slave in that part of the country who could tell me with any certainty how old he was. Few at that time knew anything of the months of the year or the days of the month. They measured the ages of their children by cherry time, harvest time, planting time, winter time, and the like. And masters allowed no questions concerning their ages to be put to them by slaves. Such questions were regarded as impertinent and evidence of a restless spirit. From certain events, however, I suppose myself to have been born in February of 1817 or 1818. Of my father, I know nothing more. Slavery had no recognition of fathers, as none of families. That the mother was a slave was enough for its deadly purposes. And by its law, the child followed the condition of its mother. The father might be a free man and the child a slave. The father might be a white man, glorying in the purity of his Anglo-Saxon blood, and the child ranked with the blackest slaves. Father he may be, and not be husband, and could sell his own child without incurring reproach if in its veins courses one drop of African blood. The practice of separating mothers from their children at an early age and hiring the mothers out at distances too great to admit of their meeting, save at rare and long intervals, is a marked feature of the cruelty and barbarity of the slave system. It has no interest in recognizing or preserving any of the ties that bind families together or to their homes. My grandmother's 5 daughters were hired out in this way, and my only recollections of my own mother, Harriet Bailey, are of a few hasty visits made in the night on foot after the daily tasks were over, and when she was under the necessity of returning in time to respond to the driver's call to the field in the early morning. Now, from these glimpses of my mother, meager as they were, I learned that I was not only a child, but somebody's child. I was grander on my mother's knee than a king on his throne. Her grace and form are ineffaceably stamped upon my memory. She was tall and finely proportioned, of dark, glossy complexion, with regular features, and was remarkably sedate and dignified. There is, in Pritchard's Natural History of Man, the head of a figure on page 157, the features of which so resemble my mother that I often recur to it with something of the feelings which I suppose you and others experience when looking upon your own dear departed ones. My first experience of life, as I now remember it, and I remember it but hazily, began in the family of my grandmother, Betsy Bailey. Grandmama Betsy lived in a cabin separate from the slave quarters and was in charge of all of the young children, and she took much comfort in having them. So with my grandmother's love in place of my mother's, I was not aware for a very long while that I was a slave. I knew many things before realizing that I was a slave. Now, the slave children were allowed to remain with grandmother until this strange personage referred to as Old Master allowed them to come and live with him. When the day came, my grandmother, who was aware of my fears, kept the truth hidden from me during the whole 12-mile journey on foot. At the end of the journey, I found myself in a huge kitchen in the midst of a group of children of all ages, sizes, and colors. Black, brown, copper colored, and nearly white. My grandmama pointed out my brother Perry and my sister Sarah and Eliza. I'd never seen them before. Grandmama said to me, "Go out and play with the children. Many of them are kin to you." I did go out, not to play, but to watch them play. Bring me a bucket of water for my oldest daughter. Draw me a bucket of water for my oldest daughter. Draw me a bucket of water for my oldest daughter. Suddenly, I ran back into the kitchen, fearing the worst. Grandmama was gone and already clean out of sight. Broken-hearted at the discovery, I threw myself on the ground and I cried a boy's bitter tears. My brother Perry gave me some peaches and some pears to comfort me. I didn't want them, I threw them on the ground. You see, I had never been deceived before. Something of resentment mingles with my grief. Oh Lord, trouble in the land, you gotta take the children out of Pharaoh's hand. You gotta take the children out of Pharaoh's hand. Gotta take the children out of Egypt's land. Gotta take the children out of Pharaoh's hand. Gotta take the children out of Egypt's land. Oh, Lord, trouble in the land. You got to take the children out of Pharaoh's hand. My master, Captain Anthony, was the superintendent of the 20 to 30 farms that belonged to Colonel Edward Lloyd. The colonel's home plantation, the seat of government for all of the out farms, wore the appearance of a country village. All the mechanical operations for the farms were performed here by the slaves. The shoemaking and mending, blacksmithing, cartwrighting, coopering, weaving, and grain grinding. The slaves called it the Great House Farm. Few privileges were esteemed higher by the slaves than being selected to go to the Great House Farm for the monthly allowance for themselves and their fellow slaves. Now, because of their constant desire to be out from under the driver's lash, they regarded it as a privilege worth careful living for. The competitors for this office sought as diligently to please their overseers as the office seekers in the political parties seek to please and deceive the people. Now, while on their way, they would make the woods for miles around reverberate with their wild songs. Now they would compose as they went along, consulting neither time nor tune. The thought that came up, came out. They would sometimes sing the most pathetic sentiment in the most rapturous tones. And into all of their songs they would manage to weave something of the Great House Farm. I'm going away to the Great House Farm. Oh, yeah. Oh, yeah. Oh, yeah. I'm going away to the Great House Farm. Oh, yeah, oh, yeah, oh, yeah, 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 oh, my, oh, master. Oh, yeah, 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 oh, yeah, oh. My old master's a good old master. Oh, yeah, oh, yeah, oh. And they would sing this as a chorus to apparently meaningless words that were full of meaning to them. Even the joyous songs were tales of woe. Every tone was a testimony against slavery and a prayer to God for deliverance from chains. To those songs, I trace my first glimmering conception of the dehumanizing character of slavery. Those songs still follow me to deepen my hatred of slavery and quicken my sympathy for my brethren in bonds. I am utterly astonished to find people in the North who refer to the singing among slaves as evidence of their contentment. It is impossible to conceive of a greater mistake. You hear the lambs are crying. Hear the lambs are crying. Hear the lambs are crying. Oh, shepherd, feed my sheep. My Lord, I love thee. Thou dost know. Oh, shepherd, feed my sheep, and give me grace to love thee more. Oh, shepherd, feed my sheep. You hear the lambs are crying. Hear the lambs are crying. Hear the lambs are crying. Oh, shepherd, feed my sheep. It was joyful news when old master decided to send me to live in Baltimore. Baltimore, the fabled city. Taking care of the little son of my new master and mistress was to be my main occupation. In fact, it was to little Tommy that old master had made a present of me. My new mistress, Sophia Auld, worked as a weaver before she married and had never owned a slave. She was incredibly kind, gentle, and cheerful. So far from deeming it impudent on the part of a slave to look us straight in the face, she seemed ever to say, "Look up, child. Look up. Don't be afraid." Well, the frequent hearing of my mistress reading the Bible aloud awakened my curiosity with respect to the mystery of reading, and emboldened me to ask her to teach me how to read. She readily consented, and in a short time I had mastered the alphabet, and I could spell words of 2, 3, 4 letters. My mistress seemed so proud of my progress. It was as if I had been her own child. And she exultantly told her husband of the aptness of her pupil and of her intention to teach me at least to read the Bible. Master Hugh was astounded beyond measure. He forbade her to give me any further instruction, telling her that it was unlawful as well as unsafe to teach a slave to read. He said, if you give a nigger an inch, he will take an L. Learning will spoil the best nigger in the world and forever unfit him to be a slave. As to the slave himself, it could do him no good, making him discontented and unhappy. This was a revelation dispelling a painful mystery with which I had struggled in vain, to wit, the white man's power to perpetuate the enslavement of the black man. Very well, thought I. Knowledge unfits a child to be a slave. Knowledge unfits a child to be a slave. Knowledge unfits a child to be a slave. From that moment, from that moment, that very moment, I understood the direct pathway from slavery to freedom. I owed as much to the bitter opposition of my master as to the kindly assistance of my mistress. I acknowledged the benefit of both. My affectionate mistress began to practice her husband's precepts. She ceased to instruct me and finally became even more violent in her opposition to my learning to read. More violent, that is, than her husband. But, you see, it was too late. Teaching me the alphabet had been the inch given. I was now waiting only for the opportunity to take the L. Did my Lord deliver Daniel, deliver Daniel, deliver Daniel? Did my Lord deliver Daniel, and why not every man? He delivered Daniel from the lion's den, Jonah from the belly of the whale, and the Hebrew children from the fire furnace. One plan I adopted in my determination to continue learning to read was to use as teachers the white playmates with whom I met in the streets. I kept a copy of Webster's spelling book in my pocket, and when sent on errands, I would step aside with one of my young friends and take a lesson in spelling. I'm greatly indebted to those boys, Gustavus Dorgan, Charles Faraday, William Cosdry. I often think of them, and very warmly. When I was about 13 years old, the thought, I am a slave for life, began to weigh heavily on my heart. Fortunately, I had, by blacking boots, earned a little money with which I purchased a popular school book. The Columbian Orator, for which I paid 50 cents. I met in the Columbian Orator Lord Chatham's speech on the great American Revolution, and speeches by the great William Pitt, Sheridan, and Fox. The reading of these speeches added so much to my limited stock of language and enabled me to give tongue to many interesting thoughts which had often flashed through my mind and then died away for want of words in which to give them utterance. Why am I a slave? Why are some people slaves and others masters? Why? I continue to search for some understanding of why this could be. I was very early told that, and I don't remember who told me this, but that God up in the sky had made all things and had made black people to be slaves and white people to be masters. I was also told that God is good. Well, this was inconsistent with my notions of goodness. I found, too, that there were puzzling exceptions to this theory of slavery. For all black people were not slaves, and all white people were not masters. To these thoughts were added some simple discoveries that it is possible to escape from slavery, and that African people had been stolen from free lives in Africa. There are thoughtful days in the lives of children, and they grapple with the great primary subjects of knowledge and reach in a moment conclusions which no subsequent experience can shake. I was as certain of the unnatural and murderous character of slavery when I was 9 years old as I am now. And I sought to learn more and more about how and why slavery was wrong, and to be ever better equipped to share what I'd learned with others. When I was 16, my master, Captain Auld, recalled me from Baltimore to Talbot County, where I was born. Auld was a cruel, stingy, and ill-tempered man. The seemings of piety soured his countenance. And though I tried to hide my contempt for him and my persistent thoughts of escape, he soon detected my rebelliousness. And by the time I had lived with Captain Auld for 9 months, he had given me several severe whippings. Your city life, he said, it almost ruins you. Ruins you for every good purpose. Defeated you for everything bad. He resolved to put me out, as he put it, to be broken. To accomplish this, he hired me out for 1 year to Edward Covey, a tenant farmer who enjoyed the reputation of being a first-rate hand at breaking young Negroes. I was now, for the first time in my life, a field hand. During the first 6 months of the year that I remained with Mr. Covey, I was whipped naked every week, so savagely as to leave welts the size of fingers on my back, on my neck. However, Mr. Covey's main weapon for breaking my spirit was hard and continued labor. Together with Hughes, his cousin, and Bill Smith, another slave hired out to Mr. Covey, I was often kept in the fields from sunup till way past midnight. I was somewhat unmanageable at first, but in a few months, Mr. Covey succeeded in breaking me. My natural elasticity was crushed. My intellect languished, and the disposition to read departed, and the oppressive night of slavery closed in upon me. And behold, a man transformed into a brute. On one of the hottest days in the month of August, 1833, and with my head and hands full of sweat and sand and blood, I made my way the 7 miles to my master's. He cannot allow his property to be thus bruised and battered. But I was wrong. I lose price of your hire for a whole year. You must go back to Kobe, or I'll get a hold of you myself. While returning through the woods, I saw Sandy. Sandy, the genuine African who had knowledge of conjuring. Well, he knew what I had been experiencing, and he said that he was going to find a route for me, and that if I carried it on my right side, neither Mr. Covey or any other white man would ever be able to whip you. You say, well, if it can't do no good, it can't do no harm. So I took the route, placed it on my right side. As I opened the gate, Mr. Covey spoke to me kindly. Go over yonder and bring in the pigs from that lot over there. Had it not been the Sabbath, I would have attributed Mr. Covey's conduct to no other influence than Sandy's route. All went well. Early Monday morning, I was called to go to the stable and curry and feed the horses. Well, I love horses. I ran, and I wanted to make sure that I understood and everybody understood that I had resolved to obey every order if possible. I saw Mr. Covey sneaking into the stable. Can't see where he is now. Suddenly seizing me by the legs, he brought me sprawling from the loft to the stable floor. At that moment, I decided to fight. As I rose from the floor, I seized Covey hard by the throat. I held on to him, he held on to me. Mr. Covey was so shocked at my response that he was trembling in every limb. I blocked every blow of his, though I dealt no blows in return. Covey said to me, as I was throwing him down, because he was trying to throw me down, he said, "Are you going to persist, boy?" And I said politely, "Yes, sir." And finally, he called for Hughes to come and help him, his cousin. His cousin grabbed me by my hand, and I gave him a kick that sent him away in pain. Then Covey said to Bill Smith. Bill Smith was another slave who had been hired out to Covey. He said, "Come and get a hold of him." And Bill Smith said, "My master sent me here to work, not to help you whip Frederick." He said, this is your work. Get a hold of him. And I said, Bill, don't you put your hands on me. And Bill Smith walked on off, leaving Covey and me to fight our battle out. Oh, we were at it for more than an hour. Finally, Covey let go of me, just trembling all over. And he said, I would not have whipped you half so hard if you had not resisted. Well, during the whole 6 months that I remained with Mr. Covey, he never again laid a finger on me, though he was heard to say from time to time, I don't want to have to get a hold of you again. Which I had no trouble in believing. This whole battle with Mr. Covey, undignified as it was, and as I fear my narration of it is, created for me a great change in my outlook. It rekindled in my breast the embers of liberty and helped me to rediscover my own manhood. But I wondered why Mr. Covey had not turned me over to the authorities. The law of Maryland stated that hanging was going to be the punishment for any slave that resisted his master. Yes, I know why he hadn't turned me over to the authorities. He was ashamed to have it known that he'd been mastered by a 15-year-old boy. Had that become known, he would have lost his reputation as the great breaker of young Negroes. A man without power is without the essential dignity of humanity. Human nature is so constituted that it cannot honor a helpless man, though it can pity him. And even this it cannot do long if signs of power do not arise. I had reached the point wherein I was not afraid to die and could not be flogged. This spirit made me a free man. In fact, though I remained a slave in form, my physical escape is now only a matter of time. You got shoes, I got shoes, all God's children got shoes. When I get to heaven, gonna put on my shoes and gonna walk all over God's heaven, heaven, heaven. Now everybody talking about heaven, ain't they going there? Heaven, heaven, heaven.
Well, you can talk about me just as much as you please. Well, I'll talk about you when I get on my knees. My son, on my journey now, my son. my journey now, Mount Zion. Well, I wouldn't take nothing, Mount Zion, for my journey now, Mount Zion. Well, I went to the valley, and I didn't go to stay, but my soul got happy, and I stayed all day, Mount Zion. On my journey now, Mount Zion, my journey now, Mount Zion. Well, I wouldn't take nothing, Mount Zion, for my journey now, Mount Zion.
I told the story of my life as a slave many times in my early work as an abolitionist speaker all over the North. I did not tell my story in detail at first or give real names, for my status as a fugitive slave required caution. I often met with hostile disruptions and violence, sometimes in towns where an abolitionist speaker had never before been heard, and often had to fight for my right to tell my story at all. And my treatment on public conveyances at about this time was extremely rough, especially on that railroad to Boston from Portland and back. On that railroad, as on many others in the North, there was a mean, dirty, uncomfortable car called the Jim Crow car. And recognizing this as one of the fruits of slavery, and having determined that I would confront and fight in the extension of slavery that I encountered, I proceeded to purchase my ticket. And to take my seat. I suppose we'll be starting move in a few minutes. I wish they would hurry it up if they can. Well, starting to move. I happened to note, and I'm not particularly surprised, that there are 6 of these fellows of the baser sort who are coming toward me, and under the direction of the conductor. And it's clear to me that their job is to eject me from my seat. And I'm thoroughly aware that they are enjoying the job. They are enjoying the job, but had not reckoned for the fact that I am very much attached to my seat. Well, we see that train seats of that particular period are not as strongly attached as our seats of today. But when the word reached the office of the superintendent that I had caused this great ruckus, his name I remember as Stephen A. Chase, and he gave emphatic instructions to all of the engineers on that line that they were not to stop in Lynn, Massachusetts, where I then lived, which was a great inconvenience to the people of Lynn, but they stood bravely by me and spoke to the management in emphatic terms. Mr. Chase replied that the railroad corporation is neither a recreational business nor a religious one. And therefore, we should not expect that the railroad would be better than the evangelical church. And until the church gets rid of the Negro pews, they will continue to maintain the Jim Crow car. Well, that was good enough as against the churches and their practices, but good for nothing in terms of the demands of justice. And I might add that this rather barbarous practice was put away within a year or two, and very largely because we were in New England, which is a haven of sorts for the abolitionists who are always creating trouble. On the one hand, I've certainly characterized myself as being a pacifist, but on the other, I'm not a pacifist. And that mixture of conflicting elements in me began to cause increasing conflict between myself and my friends in the American Anti-Slavery Society. Many of them were men who believed in moral suasion only. When I began to speak of abolitionist policy as well as my life as a slave, one colleague warned, better to have a little of the plantation in your speech than not. It is best that you not seem too learned. They won't believe you were ever a slave. Another colleague urged me to stick to the facts. We'll take care of the philosophy. Against the advice of friends who feared for my security as a fugitive slave, I departed further from my early role as an exhibit of the humanity of the slave and the inhumanity of slavery by writing an autobiography, giving names, dates, and places including my own, Frederick Augustus Washington Bailey, which I had changed to Frederick Douglass in the North to disguise my identity. However, I did travel to England on the advice of friends who knew that my book would undoubtedly alert the slaveholders and those who were employed to find and bring back escaped slaves. British abolitionists welcomed me warmly and encouraged me to speak on every aspect of the abolitionist movement. My visit there was meaningful to me in every way. There were a vast number of extremely sensitive and educated people there, men and women, whose acquaintance I made, and among them there were some friends. And then they, upon recognizing that I had to return home, raised enough money for me to buy my freedom from Captain Auld, and then raise more so that I might be able to return home and start my own printing press, my own newspaper, which I called the North Star, guiding star for the escape from freedom, or rather to freedom from slavery, and symbol of freedom for my people.
It has long been our wish to see in this slave-holding, slave-trading, and Negro-hating land a printing press and paper permanently established under the control and direction of the immediate victims of oppression. I believe that such a journal, if conducted with only moderate skill and ability, would do an indispensable work which our right friends could not do for us. Common and only folly denies that the man who has suffered the wrong is the man to demand redress, that the man struck is the man to cry out. We must be our own advocates, not exclusively, but peculiarly, not apart from, but in connection with our right friends. I shall be under no political party or society, but shall advocate the slave's cause in all ways which, in my judgment, will be best suited to the advancement of the cause.
The opening phrase of the first issue of the North Star was, "Right is of no sex." I attended the first convention for women's rights in Seneca Falls, New York, in 1847. And I was, I'm told, the only man who voted for the resolution on women's suffrage. You know, when I escaped from slavery, it was for myself. And when I advocate emancipation, it is for my people. But when I stand up for the rights of women, self is out of the question. And I find a little nobility in the effort. Thus far, all governments, in my opinion, have been failures. And I'm not alone in this feeling. The nations have been little more than armed camps, spending their wealth and ingenuity in forging weapons of destruction against each other. And while it may not be contended that the introduction of women in government would cure this tendency to exalt might over right, many reasons can be given to show that women's influence, I say women's influence, would help to check and modify it. I've never found one argument, not one argument in favor of man's right to vote that does not equally apply to women. You know, to find valuable qualities in our fellows, such qualities must be presumed and expected. Exclusion of women from a voice in civil government not only degrades women, but repudiates one half of the wisdom available to the government of the world. A women's right to equal liberty with man is one of the great truths. She was born with it. It was hers before she comprehended it. Now that this great truth has got fairly fixed in the minds of the few, I believe it's bound to go on till it becomes the thought of the world. The most active organization of women in Rochester, New York, where I lived during my years as editor, was the Ladies' Anti-Slavery Society. I could rely on certain brave members of that society in my work as station master and conductor on the Underground Railroad in Rochester. It was the last station on the line in the escape route to Canada for fugitive slaves who were in danger of recapture. Fines and imprisonment were the penalties imposed by the fugitive slave law for feeding, harboring, or otherwise aiding a slave to escape. But I must say that the ladies, not one lady, in fact, ever faltered when called upon. And for myself, I can say that I've never done more congenial, attractive, or satisfying work. True, as a means of destroying slavery, it's like trying to empty an ocean with a teaspoon. But the thought that there was one less slave and one more free man, brought to my heart unspeakable joy. In 1852, the Ladies' Anti-Slavery Society asked if I would give an oration at Corinthian Hall, where I had spoken a number of times previous years, an oration subject of which was without question a very touchy one: the meaning of the 4th of July to the slave. Yes, no matter how much caution was employed here, one was still not too terribly comfortable about taking on such an assignment. But I felt that it had to be done, and the ladies felt that it ought to be done, so that was quite enough for me. They referred to me in their pamphlets as Rochester's most distinguished citizen, and all such. And they proceeded to make the populace aware of the fact that such a speech was going to be rendered. Ladies and gentlemen, fellow citizens and friends, the task before me is one which requires much previous thought and study for its proper performance. I know that apologies of this sort are generally looked upon as being flat and unmeaning. I trust, however, that mine will not be so considered. Now, the papers and placards say that I am to deliver a 4th of July oration. Now, this sounds mighty large and out of the common way for me. The fact is, ladies and gentlemen, the distance between this platform and the slave plantation from which I escaped is considerable. And the difficulties to be overcome in getting from the one to the other are by no means slight. That I am here today is to me a matter of great astonishment, as well as of gratitude. Today is the birthday of your national independence and of your political freedom. It is what the Passover was to the emancipated people of God, and it carries your minds back to the day and to the act of your deliverance. The 4th of July is the first great fact in your nation's history, the very ring bolt in the chain of your yet undeveloped destiny. Fellow citizens, pardon me and allow me to ask, why am I called upon to speak here today? What have I, or those I represent, to do with your independence? Am I, therefore, called upon to bring our humble offering to the national altar and to confess the benefits and express devout gratitude for the blessings resulting from your independence to us? Would to God, both for your sakes and ours, that an affirmative answer could be truthfully returned to these questions, then would my task be light and my burden easy, easy and delightful. For who is there so cold that a nation's sympathy could not warm him? Who so stolid and selfish that would not give his voice to swell the hallelujahs of a nation's jubilee when the chains of servitude had been torn from his limbs? I am not that man. I am not that man. In a case like that, the dumb might eloquently speak, and the lame man leap like a hare. But such is not the state of the case. I say it with a sad sense of disparity between us. I am not included within the pale of this glorious anniversary. Your high independence only reveals the immeasurable distance between us. This 4th of July is yours, not mine. You may rejoice. I must mourn. To drag a man in fetters into the grand illuminated temple of liberty and call upon him to join you in joyous anthems were inhuman mockery and self-destructive irony. Do you mean, citizens, to mock me by asking me to speak here today? If so, there is a parallel to your conduct, and let me warn you that it is dangerous to copy the example of a nation whose crimes, towering up to heaven, were blown down by the breath of the Almighty, burying that nation in irrevocable ruin. I can today take up the lament of a peeled and woe-smitten people. By the rivers of Babylon, there we sat down. Yea, we wept when we remembered Zion. We hanged our harps upon the willows in the midst thereof, for there they that carried us away captive required of us a song, and they who wasted us required of us mirth, saying, "Sing us one of the songs of Zion." How can we sing the Lord's song in a strange land? If I forget thee, O Jerusalem, let my right hand forget her cunning. If I do not remember thee, let my tongue cleave to the roof of my mouth. Fellow citizens, above your national tumultuous joy, I hear the mournful wail of millions whose chains, heavy and grievous yesterday, or today, rendered even more intolerable by the Jubilee shouts that reach them. If I do forget, if I do not faithfully remember, those bleeding children of sorrow this day. May my right hand forget her cunning, and may my tongue cleave to the roof of my mouth. To forget them, to pass lightly over their wrongs, and to chime in with the popular theme would be treason. Treason, most scandalous and shocking, and would make me a reproach before God and the world. My subject, then, fellow citizens, is American slavery. I shall see this day and its popular characteristics from the slave's point of view. Standing here, identified with the American bondman, making his wrongs mine, I do not hesitate to declare with all my soul that the character and conduct of this nation never looked more bleak to me than on this day. On this 4th of July. America is false to the past, false to the present, and solemnly binds herself to be false to the future. Standing with God and a crushed and bleeding slave on this occasion, I will, in the name of humanity which is outraged, in the name of the Constitution and the Bible, which are disregarded and trampled upon, dare to call in question and to denounce with all the emphasis I can command everything that serves to perpetuate slavery. Slavery. The great sin and shame of America. I will not equivocate. I will not excuse. I will use the severest language I can command. And yet, not one word shall escape me that any man whose judgment is not blinded by prejudice, or who is not at heart a slaveholder, shall not confess to be right and just. And I fancy I hear someone in my audience say, it is just in this circumstance that you and your brother abolitionists fail to make a favorable impression. A favorable impression on the public mind. Would you argue more and denounce less? Would you persuade more and rebuke less? Your cause would be much more likely to succeed. But I submit, where all is plain, there is nothing to be argued. What point in the anti-slavery creed would you have me argue? Must I undertake to prove that the slave is a man? That point is conceded. Nobody doubts it. The slaveholders themselves acknowledge it in the enactment of laws for their government. They acknowledge it when they punish disobedience on the part of the slave. There are 72 crimes in the state of Virginia which if committed by a black man, no matter how ignorant he be, subject him to the punishment of death, while only 2 of these same crimes will subject a white man to like punishment. What is this? What is this but the acknowledgement that the slave is a moral, intellectual, and responsible being? The manhood of the slave is conceded. It is admitted in the fact that the Southern statute books are covered with enactments that forbid teaching a slave to read or write. When you can point to any such laws in reference to the beasts of the field, then I may consent to argue the manhood of the slave. For the present, it is enough to affirm the equal manhood of the Negro race. Is it not astonishing that while we are plowing, planting, reaping, using all kinds of mechanical tools, erecting houses, constructing bridges, building ships, working in metals of brass, iron, copper, silver, and gold, that while we are reading, writing, and ciphering, acting as clerks, merchants, and secretaries, having among us lawyers, doctors, ministers, poets, authors, editors, orators, and teachers, that while we're engaged in all of the enterprises common to other men, digging gold in California, capturing the whale in the Pacific, feeding sheep and cattle on the hillside, living, moving, acting, thinking, planning, living in families as husbands, wives, and children, and above all, confessing and worshiping the Christian God and looking hopefully for life and immortality beyond the grave, we are called upon to prove that we are men. Would you have me argue that man is entitled to liberty? That he is the rightful owner of his own body? You've already declared it. Must I argue the wrongfulness of slavery? Is that a question for us? There is not a man beneath the canopy of heaven who does not know that slavery is wrong for him. What then remains to be argued? Is it that slavery is not divine? That God did not establish it? That our doctors of divinity are mistaken? There is blasphemy in the thought. That which is inhuman cannot be divine. Who can reason on such a proposition? They that can may. I cannot. At a time like this, it is not light that is needed, but fire. We need the storm, the whirlwind, and the earthquake. The feelings of the nation must be quickened. The conscience, the conscience of the nation must be aroused. The propriety of the nation must be startled. The hypocrisy hypocrisy of the nation must be exposed, and its crimes against God and man must be denounced. What to the American slave is your 4th of July? I answer, a day that reveals to him, more than all the other days of the year, the gross injustice and cruelty to which he is the constant victim. To him, your celebration is a sham. Your prayers and hymns, your sermons and thanksgivings, with all your religious solemnity and parade, are to him mere bombast, fraud, deception, impiety, and hypocrisy. A thin veil, a very thin veil, to cover up crimes which would disgrace a nation of savages. There is not a nation on earth guilty of practices more shocking and bloody than are the people of these United States at this very hour. Go where you will. Search where you will. Roam through all the monarchies and despotisms of the old world. Travel through South America. Search out every abuse. And when you have found the last, lay your facts by the side of the everyday practices of this nation, and you will say with me that for revolting barbarity, and shameless hypocrisy, America reigns without a rival. Thank you.